Get back. We've got a team coming. Get back. Your team's 3 minutes out. She was already stripping off her cardigan, tying it around her face. They'll be dead in 90 seconds, 12 Navy SEALs. Trapped behind a steel door that had been deliberately rigged not to open. A fire burning 40% hotter than anything on the approved manifest. And the only person moving toward that building instead of away from it was a 5'3" logistics clerk who counted ration boxes for a living. She went over the chain link fence like it wasn't there. She walked into the flames like she was late for a meeting. 40 minutes later, medics cut away her burnt clothing to treat second-degree burns on both palms, and the room went completely silent. Because underneath that ruined civilian cardigan was a rank insignia that did not exist in any personnel file on that entire base. The fire alarm at Cypress Point Advanced Training Annex had never once gone off by accident. Not in 9 years. Not in 100 drills. So when it screamed through the compound at 9:47 on a Tuesday night, every instructor on the base knew in the first half second that something was wrong. Because alarms like that don't lie. Except this one wasn't supposed to be real. Inside a burning cinderblock shoot house on the Eastern Range, 12 Navy SEALs were trapped behind a jammed steel door, and the woman who would pull every last one of them out was, as far as her personnel file was concerned, a 27-year-old logistics coordinator named Grace Sullivan, who filed inventory requisitions and made really excellent coffee. That file was about to become the least accurate document on the entire base. Rewind 3 days. Grace Sullivan sat at a metal desk in Building 14, third cubicle from the window, counting boxes of MRE rations with the kind of focus most people reserve for diffusing something. Which, in a way, she was. Because counting was a discipline. And discipline was the only thing keeping 5 years of training folded up small enough to fit inside a beige cardigan and a laminated visitor badge that said civilian contractor in black letters no one ever bothered to question. She was 27. 5'3" in boots. The kind of pretty that made men underestimate her by roughly 4 seconds, which was, coincidentally, about how long it would take her to put 2 rounds through a target's chest cavity at 300 yards. Not that anyone at Cypress Point had seen her shoot. That was the point. Her cubicle neighbor, a civilian records clerk named Marjorie Fenn, had worked at Cypress Point for 11 years and considered herself an excellent judge of character. She had pegged Grace Sullivan, on the very first day, as exactly the kind of quiet young woman who never caused trouble. She was wrong about that. She just didn't know it yet. You always sit like that, Marjorie said one Tuesday afternoon, not looking up from her own paperwork. Facing the door. Habit, funny habit. For somebody who counts boxes for a living. Grace didn't answer that. She had learned, over 11 weeks, that silence was the safest possible response to an observation like that one. Worn like a second cardigan. Comfortable, unremarkable, impossible to read if you didn't fight it. Except Marjorie kept talking, because Marjorie always kept talking. And you don't flinch, you know that? Loud noise, somebody drops a stapler, half this office jumps a foot. Not you. You just look, like you're checking where it came from. Occupational hazard of logistics. Logistics doesn't teach you that. Marjorie finally glanced up, sharp behind her reading glasses, and for one unguarded second Grace felt the particular chill of being seen by someone who had no earthly reason to be looking that closely. My nephew's army. Does the same thing. Looks like a tick. Isn't one. Grace smiled. The practiced kind, warm enough to end a conversation without inviting a follow-up question. You should tell him it's rude to stare. Marjorie laughed and went back to her paperwork, and the moment passed, the way most moments passed at Cypress Point, folded quietly into the general noise of a Tuesday. But Grace filed it, the way she filed everything. Marjorie Fenn noticed things. Marjorie Fenn would need to be accounted for. Sullivan. Petty Officer Ruiz leaned into the doorway, chewing gum like it owed him money. You seeing this? Seeing what? Come look. She didn't move right away. She finished the row she was counting first. 42 boxes, 43 because that was the rule. Finish the count. Then look up. Habits like that didn't come from a logistics manual. They came from somewhere else entirely. Somewhere she didn't talk about, not even in her sleep, not anymore. Then she looked up. Through the window, past the motor pool, she could see the SEAL candidates running the evening obstacle course in the floodlights, 12 men moving as one organism, boots hitting gravel in a rhythm that sounded almost like a heartbeat if you stood close enough. Grace had watched this same drill run 11 times in 3 months. She knew which candidate favored his left knee. She knew which one was faking his confidence. She knew, without meaning to know it, that the rope on the cargo net obstacle had frayed at the 3rd rung, and someone should probably replace it before it snapped under load. She had reported it. Twice. Nobody had. That was the kind of thing that kept her up at night. Not fear. Just math. Frayed rope plus 200 pounds of gear equals a bad Tuesday for somebody. They're doing the night CQB run after this, Ruiz said. Full 12-man stack, live smoke, simunition, the works. Command wants it filmed for the training reel. Who authorized live smoke inside the shoot house? Ruiz shrugged like it wasn't his problem. Because it wasn't. Above my pay grade. Above mine too, Grace said, and went back to counting boxes. Because that was the role. That was the whole point of the role. You didn't ask the second question. You asked the first one, quietly, and then you let it go, and you wrote a note in a file nobody read, and you went home to an apartment with too few photographs on the wall and too many locks on the door. Except some nights the letting go didn't come easy, which was strange, because Grace Sullivan had spent her whole life learning how to let things go. She'd learned it from her mother, who let go of the Navy the day she turned 18 and never looked back. And she'd learned the opposite of it, the holding on, from a woman who'd been dead for 11 years and had never once, in Grace's memory, raised her voice above a whisper. Her grandmother. Eleanor Whitcomb Sullivan had served during the Korean War in a communications unit so classified that the official record listed her only as a typist in San Diego. That was the story the Navy kept on file. Typist, filing paperwork. Nothing more interesting than that. It was not quite the story her own daughter had ever fully believed, though it would take another 27 years for anyone to prove exactly why. Grace had believed it too, until she was 14 years old and found a locked wooden box under her grandmother's bed while looking for Christmas presents that weren't there. Inside the box, a citation with half the paragraph blacked out by a censor's pen. A photograph of 6 women standing in front of a Quonset hut, none of them smiling, all of them looking at the camera like they knew something the camera didn't. And a single silver pin, shaped like a compass rose with no unit designation anywhere on it. No name, no explanation. What is this, Grandma? Eleanor had taken the box gently from her granddaughter's hands, closed the lid, set it back exactly where it had been, at the same angle, dust undisturbed, like it had never moved at all. That, she said, is a very long story that nobody wanted to hear when I was young enough for it to matter. I want to hear it. I know you do. Eleanor smiled, but it didn't reach all the way to her eyes. That's what worries me. She never did tell the story. Not that year, not the next. By the time Grace turned 16, her grandmother's hands had started to shake too badly to hold a coffee cup steady. And by the time she turned 19, Eleanor was gone, and the box went into a storage unit in Bakersfield along with 3 boxes of mismatched dishware and a rocking chair nobody wanted. But there was one afternoon, the summer Grace turned 15, when the almost telling happened anyway. They were out behind Eleanor's house in Bakersfield, in the flat dry heat that turned the air itself the color of old paper, and Eleanor had lined up 6 soup cans on a fence rail and handed her granddaughter a borrowed .22 rifle, like it was the most ordinary thing in the world for a grandmother to do on a Sunday. Elbow down. Not locked. Down, it feels wrong. Everything worth doing feels wrong before it feels right. Eleanor adjusted her granddaughter's stance with 2 fingers, light as a suggestion. Breathe out. Not all the way. Halfway. Then stop. Grace fired. Missed the can by 1.5 feet. Again she fired 6 more times before she hit anything, and when the 3rd can finally toppled off the rail, Eleanor didn't clap or cheer the way Grace expected a grandmother to. She just nodded. Once. Like she'd confirmed something she already suspected. Who taught you to do that? Grace asked, lowering the rifle. The breathing part. Somebody who needed me to be very good at it, very fast, a long time ago. During the typing? Something moved across Eleanor's face then, quick, gone before Grace could name it. During the typing, she agreed, and there was an edge underneath the word that a 15-year-old didn't yet have the tools to hear, though a 27-year-old, replaying the memory 100 times since, heard it clearly enough now. Grief. Or something close to it. The particular ache of a woman who had spent decades shrinking a truth down small enough to fit inside a lie everyone found easier to believe. Will you ever tell me? For real? Eleanor looked at her for a long moment, the fence rail and the empty cans, and the heat shimmering between them, and said the thing Grace would carry for the rest of her life, long after the woman who said it was gone. Some doors don't open because somebody locked them. They open because somebody, someday, finally has a good enough reason to knock. She set the rifle down, careful, deliberate. You're not old enough for the reason yet. I hope you never have to be. 12 years later, that reason finally arrived. It arrived while Grace stood in a cinder-block hallway with smoke pouring past her boots and 12 men's lives balanced on how fast she could move, and she understood, with the strange clarity that only comes in the worst possible moment, that her grandmother had handed her a door a long time ago and never once said what was behind it, only how to knock. Grace kept the pin, wore it sometimes, pinned to the inside of a jacket pocket where nobody could see it. Not for luck. She didn't believe in luck. She believed in preparation and redundancy and the idea that somewhere, in a filing cabinet or a server or a dead man's memory, the truth about her grandmother was still sitting there, waiting for someone to go looking for it. Her mother had never gone looking. Diane Sullivan had spent 40 years being angry at an institution that took her mother's best years and gave nothing back but a folded flag and a pension that didn't cover the mortgage. She didn't talk about Eleanor's service. She barely talked about Eleanor at all. So when Grace enlisted at 22 quietly, without asking permission because she was an adult and didn't need it, Diane didn't come to the ceremony, didn't call for 6 months. And when she finally did call, the first thing she said wasn't hello. It was, "You have no idea what you're walking into." "I think I do, you don't." A pause, long enough that Grace could hear her mother's television playing in the background, some rerun, laugh track rolling over silence that wasn't funny at all. "They chew up women like us, and they call it an honor. Your grandmother gave them everything. Everything, Grace. And they erased her. Just like that. Like she was never even in the room. Then maybe somebody should put her back in the room. You think this is about her?" Diane's voice had gone tight, quiet in the way that always meant the opposite of calm. "It's not. It's about you, thinking you can fix something that broke before you were born. Maybe it doesn't need fixing. Maybe it needs finishing. Those aren't the same thing, Grace. They're closer than you want them to be. You don't know what they do to people who ask too many questions. I watched it happen to her. I watched her get smaller every single year, and nobody ever told us why, and nobody ever will. And you signing paperwork isn't going to change 40 years of the Navy deciding your grandmother's story wasn't worth the ink. Then I'll bring my own ink. That's not brave. That's just louder. Maybe loud is what it takes." A long pause on the line, long enough that Grace could hear her mother breathing, unsteady, the sound of someone deciding whether to keep fighting a battle she'd already lost the moment her daughter signed the paperwork. "I can't watch it happen twice," Diane said finally, quieter now, all the fight gone out of it. "I can't. You won't have to watch anything, I'm not her." That's exactly what she would have said too. Diane didn't answer after that. She'd hung up instead, and it had taken 8 months for them to speak again. And even now, 5 years later, there was a wall between them made of things neither one wanted to say out loud. Grace thought about that wall a lot. Usually late at night. Usually while she was doing something that had nothing to do with walls at all. Like field stripping a weapon she wasn't technically supposed to own on a base where she was technically a civilian. Which brought her back, always, to the desk. To the boxes. To the badge that said contractor and the file that said nothing true. Her actual rank was lieutenant commander. Her actual assignment had a name that existed on exactly 4 servers in the continental United States, none of them located anywhere near Cypress Point. Her actual reason for being here had a folder thickness of about 2 inches and a working title that read, in flat gray letters, Inquiry 40-7, Irregular Procurement Patterns, Cypress Point Training Annex. Someone was skimming. That much the folder already knew. Equipment requisitions that didn't match delivery manifests. Training materials purchased from a single contractor at prices that made no sense unless somebody, somewhere, was getting a kickback for looking the other way. Small stuff, on paper. The kind of small stuff that either meant nothing or meant everything, depending on how far down you were willing to dig. 6 names sat in a locked file on a laptop that never left her apartment overnight. 4 of them belonged to procurement officers who had signed off on invoices without reading past the total. Explainable. Careless, maybe, but not criminal on its own. The fifth name belonged to the company, Kessler Dynamics, a mid-sized defense contractor out of Northern Virginia that had, over the last 3 years, quietly become the exclusive supplier of training materials for 4 separate installations, Cypress Point among them, at prices that consistently ran 12 to 18% above comparable bids from anyone else. Nobody had flagged it. Nobody had needed to, because the paperwork, on its surface, was flawless. Too flawless. If you'd spent 11 years learning the difference between a system that was clean and a system that had simply been cleaned, the sixth name was the one that mattered, and it didn't have a face yet. Just a signature, the same 3 initials, co-signed on every contract renewal for the last 2 years, buried far enough down the approval chain that whoever it belonged to had almost certainly never expected anyone to come looking. Grace had a working theory. She didn't have proof. And she had learned, a long time ago, from a grandmother who never got to finish her own story, that a theory without proof was just a rumor wearing a nicer coat. So she counted boxes. And she waited. And she told herself that patience was not the same thing as doing nothing. Even on the nights it felt exactly like doing nothing. Even as the folder on her laptop grew thicker, and the 6 names stayed exactly 6 names for 11 straight weeks. That would change tonight. Not because of anything in the folder. Because of a fire that had no business being real. Grace had been digging for 11 weeks. She had a list of 6 names. She had not yet found the one that mattered. She would find it tonight. Not because she went looking for it. Because it was about to come looking for her, wrapped in smoke and fire and 12 men's lives. And there would be no folder thick enough, no cover story convincing enough, to keep her hands clean once it did. She had spoken to Master Chief Reyes exactly twice in 11 weeks. Both times about paperwork, both times short enough that neither of them would have called it a conversation. The third time was different, though neither of them knew it yet. It happened that same afternoon, hours before the fire, when a controlled detonation on the demolition range, 300 yards south of Building 14, went off a half-second earlier than scheduled. A flat, hard crack, close enough to rattle windows. And every civilian employee in the building flinched, ducked, or froze exactly the way you'd expect people to. Grace didn't do any of those things. She was standing by the coffee machine when it happened, and in the half-second between the sound reaching her ears and her conscious mind catching up to the fact that it was a scheduled detonation and not a threat, her body had already identified the rough bearing of the blast, calculated distance by the delay between concussion and echo, and shifted her weight fractionally toward the nearest structural cover. All of that took under a second. All of it was completely unnecessary. And all of it happened in full view of Master Chief Reyes, who had walked in through the side door at exactly the wrong moment to pour a coffee of his own. He didn't say anything right away. He filled his cup, added creamer, stirred it with the particular unhurried patience of a man who had spent 2 decades learning that silence made people talk faster than questions did. "Big fan of demolition schedules," he said finally, for a supply clerk. "You get used to loud noises around here. That wasn't getting used to it." He took a sip, watching her over the rim of the cup. "That was something else. I've seen recruits do that. Takes about 8 weeks of training to build a flinch response like that into muscle memory. Longer to build the part where you don't flinch at all. You just move. Maybe I just have good reflexes. Maybe." He didn't sound like he believed it. And he didn't sound like he particularly cared to push the point. Not that afternoon. "Have a good day, Miss Sullivan." He left before she could decide whether that had been a warning or an invitation. Grace stood by the coffee machine a moment longer than she needed to, replaying the last 4 seconds in her head, cataloging the mistake the way she cataloged every mistake, filed and flagged for later, and told herself it didn't matter. 11 weeks of care undone by one badly timed cup of coffee. It happened. It would not happen again. She had no way of knowing, standing there with a lukewarm cup going cold in her hand, that in 6 hours she would blow the entire cover wide open herself. On purpose, in front of considerably more witnesses than one Master Chief with good instincts and a full cup of coffee. At 9:40 that evening, the 12 SEAL candidates finished their obstacle course and jogged, breathing hard, toward the eastern range, where a low cinder-block structure sat behind a chain-link fence marked restricted. Master Chief Owen Reyes walked the line of them, clipboard under one arm, counting heads the way he'd counted heads for 18 years, out of habit, Not because he expected to lose anyone. Listen up. His voice carried without needing volume. Full stack entry. Live smoke charges on my mark. Simunition rounds. Standard clearing sequence. This gets filmed. This gets used for training. Which means you do it right. Or you do it again until you do. A ripple of exhausted laughter. Someone, near the back, muttered something about doing it a third time being cruel and unusual. Reyes ignored it, because that was also a habit. 18 years deep. He didn't know that the smoke charges rigged inside the structure that night had been swapped 4 days earlier. Didn't know that the chemical compound packed into 2 of the 6 canisters had been altered just enough to burn hotter, faster, and dirtier than anything on the approved manifest. Didn't know that the steel emergency exit at the rear of the structure, the one every safety briefing promised would open from the inside under any conditions, had been quietly modified so that it would not. Nobody knew that. Not the 12 men walking through the door. Not Reyes, standing at the entry point with his clipboard and his 18 years of habit. Not the 2 safety observers stationed 40 yards back with fire extinguishers they would, within the hour, find themselves completely unable to use. And not Grace Sullivan, 300 yards away in Building 14, finishing the last box in her count, 44-45, and reaching for her jacket, because her shift had technically ended 11 minutes ago, and there was a frozen dinner waiting in her apartment with her name on it. Figuratively, since her name wasn't really her name either. She was halfway to the door when the first explosion hit. It didn't sound like an explosion. Not the movie kind. It sounded like a door slamming somewhere far away. A low, flat concussion that rattled the window glass and made every coffee cup in Building 14 shiver half an inch across its saucer. Grace's whole body went still before her brain finished processing the sound. That was training. That was 11 years of training, doing what it was built to do, moving faster than thought. Then the second explosion came, closer, sharper, and through the window she saw it. Black smoke boiling up over the eastern range in a column too fast and too thick for anything that had been on the approved manifest. She was running before she decided to run. Outside, the alarm was already screaming, red lights strobing off the motor pool fence, and figures were converging from every direction. Safety officers, instructors, 2 men with extinguishers who were already discovering in real time that the fire eating through that cinder block structure did not care about extinguishers rated for ordinary combustibles. This fire was hungry in a way that ordinary fires weren't. This fire had been made to be hungry. Exits jammed. Someone was screaming it, over and over, a raw, ragged sound that cut through the alarm. The rear door won't open. It won't open. They're stacked up at the door, they're stacked up. Grace reached the chain link fence and did not slow down to find the gate. She went over it. One hand on the top rail, body folding through the air with an economy of motion that no logistics coordinator in the history of the United States Navy had ever demonstrated, and landed running on the other side. And if anyone had been watching closely enough, if anyone had not been entirely consumed by the sight of black smoke pouring out of a building with 12 men trapped inside it, they might have noticed that Grace Sullivan moved like someone who had done this before, many times, in places far worse than a training annex in California. Nobody was watching closely enough. Everyone was watching the fire. Chief Petty Officer Foster Whitlock, one of the 2 safety observers stationed 40 yards back, would tell the story for years afterward, and it would never once change in the telling, because some things burn themselves into memory exactly as they happened and refuse all embellishment. She went over that fence, he'd say, like the fence wasn't even there, like it was an afterthought, and then she just walked into the fire. Not ran. Walked. Like she'd made the decision 3 seconds before the rest of us even understood there was a decision to make. He hadn't moved to stop her. Nobody had. There hadn't been time. And there hadn't, if he was honest with himself later, been the presence of mind, because everyone on that field had spent their whole career believing they knew exactly what courage looked like, uniformed, trained, certified, and none of them had a single frame of reference for a woman in a beige cardigan walking into a structure fire like she was late for a meeting. The fire trucks were still 4 minutes out. The rescue team command had scrambled together, was 90 seconds behind them. In the gap between those 2 facts sat 12 men, a jammed door, and 1 person on the entire installation who had apparently decided that 4 minutes was 4 minutes too long to wait. and would find out later, in full, exactly what a decision like that cost a body forced to make it alone. The heat hit her 20 feet out, a solid wall of it, the kind that made your eyes water and your skin feel suddenly urgently aware of every inch of exposed surface. Smoke poured out of the shattered observation window in a black river, and underneath the roar of the flames she could hear it, pounding, fists on steel, voices, muffled and desperate, shouting words that didn't matter anymore, because the door wasn't opening and everyone on the outside already knew it wasn't opening, and standing there screaming about, it wasn't going to change that fact. Someone grabbed her arm. Reyes' face streaked with soot, eyes wide with something closer to shock than fear. "Get back. We've got a team coming. Get back. Your team's 3 minutes out." Her voice came out flat, certain. Nothing like the voice that filed inventory requisitions in Building 14. "They'll be dead in 90 seconds. You don't know that. I know fire." She was already moving past him, already stripping off her cardigan, already tying it around the lower half of her face, in a motion so practiced it looked choreographed. "Where's the primary entry point? You can't go in there. You're not. Where's the entry point, Master Chief?" Something in the way she said his rank made him answer before his brain caught up to the fact that a logistics coordinator shouldn't know what a Master Chief's job title meant, let alone say it like a command. "North side. Original breach point. It's the only way through. The rear's sealed." Grace was already running. The north entry was a rectangle of orange light in a wall of black smoke, heat radiating off it in visible waves, and she went through it low, staying under the worst of the smoke the way she'd been taught to do it, the way she'd practiced doing it in 100 drills that had never once, until tonight, been real. Inside, the world was reduced to sound and heat and the burning ache of smoke clawing down her throat. She could hear them now, closer, the pounding on the rear door, voices raw from shouting, and somewhere underneath it a lower sound, a groaning creak that meant the structure itself was starting to fail. "Sound off!" Her voice cracked through the smoke. Pitched to carry, pitched the way command voices were trained to carry. "Sound off, count yourselves now." A stunned half-second, then ragged, disbelieving, a voice answered. 2. The count rolled through the smoke, voice after voice, and Grace used it like a compass, moving toward the cluster of sound, hand out in front of her, fingers brushing hot metal, hot concrete, until they found fabric, a shoulder, a man. "Down and out, follow my hand, go." She didn't wait to see if he obeyed. She knew he would because that was what training did to a body in a crisis. It made obedience automatic when a voice sounded certain enough. And hers sounded certain because underneath the smoke and the fear she was, in fact, entirely certain. She had done this. Not this exact thing, but this shape of thing, this exact geometry of fire and panic, and men who needed someone else's calm more than they needed their own courage. One by one she pulled them toward the north breach. 2. 3. The third one was young, barely out of Buddhist by the look of him, name stenciled across his gear as Alvarez, coughing so hard he could barely stand upright. Grace got an arm under him and half carried him the last 10 feet toward the breach. "I got you. Almost there." "Who?" He coughed, doubled over, coughed again. "Who are you?" "Somebody who needs you to keep walking. Talk later." She shoved him out into the floodlights and the waiting hands of the safety team, and turned straight back around without breaking stride, because there wasn't time for a name, hers or his, and there wouldn't be time for a long while yet. 4. The fourth had frozen flat against the wall, palms pressed to hot concrete, eyes wide and fixed on nothing. The particular paralysis panic produces even in the best trained bodies once the brain simply refuses to process what it's looking at. "Hey." Grace gripped his shoulder, one sharp shake. "Look at me. Not the fire, me." He looked at her. "Good, now move your feet. Just your feet, I'll handle the rest." It worked. It always worked, that particular trick, because panic needed something enormous to fight, and a single small instruction was too small a thing to argue with. He moved his feet. She moved the rest of him. 6 feet became 16, became the north breach, and someone else's hands taking his weight. 5. The heat was worse now. The rear door groaned, metal warping under a fire that had been designed quietly, deliberately, to burn far past anything a safety manifest would have allowed. Somewhere above her a support beam let out a sound like a rifle shot, and a shower of burning debris rained down 6 feet to her left. 6. 7. A ceiling panel let go directly overhead, and she threw herself sideways on instinct alone. dragging the man in her grip down with her, and the burning debris hit the concrete exactly where they'd been standing a half-second earlier. No time to think about how close. No time for anything except the next name in the count, the next hand finding fabric in the dark. Her hands were burning. She knew that in some distant clinical part of her brain, the part that had been trained to catalog injuries and keep functioning anyway, log it, deal with it later, move. Her palms had gone from stinging to something worse, something she would not let herself think about until this was over. 8. I've got you, move, 9. By the 10th man, her voice had gone from a shout to something rougher, smoke doing what smoke does to a throat, but she didn't stop, because there were still 2 men unaccounted for, and the beam above the rear door had started to sag in a way that meant it had somewhere between 30 seconds and no seconds left before it came down entirely. Reyes. She'd found him, or he'd found her, blackened and coughing near the jammed rear exit, still trying to force it, still trying to do his job even as the smoke closed in around him. 2 more. Where? Behind the equipment rack. His voice tore on the words. Pinned, the shelving came down, I can't. She was already moving. The equipment rack had collapsed sideways under some earlier concussion, steel shelving pinning 2 men against the wall in a tangle of twisted metal and fallen gear, and one of them, she registered distantly, was bleeding from a gash above his eye, badly enough that the blood had gone black in the firelight. Grace got her shoulder under the edge of the collapsed rack and lifted with everything a 5'3" frame had never been expected by anyone to contain. It didn't move. Not at first. Fire roared somewhere close enough now to feel like a living thing breathing on the back of her neck, and she planted her feet and drove upward with a scream that had no words in it at all. Just effort, just refusal, and the rack groaned and shifted 6 inches. Just enough. Out. Now go. The 2 men scrambled free. One of them grabbed her arm on the way past, tried to pull her with him, and she shook him off because Reyes was still 3 feet away, and the beam above the door had started to fall. She got him moving. Got both of them moving. And as the last of the 12 stumbled out through the north breach into floodlights and screaming, and the distant wail of approaching fire trucks, the rear support beam finally gave way completely, and the roof of the shoot house came down in a roar of sparks and collapsing steel not 4 seconds behind her. 12 men counted, 12 men out. Not one left behind, not one exception, not one name unaccounted for in a night that had offered exactly 0 margin for error and received, somehow exactly 0 errors in return. She was the last one out. The night air hit her like something solid, cold where the fire had been unbearable, and her legs simply stopped working about 6 feet past the fence line. She went down onto one knee, then both, chest heaving, hands finally allowed to register what they had been through, and the last thing she saw clearly before the world tilted sideways and went dark at the edges was Master Chief Reyes's face, soot-streaked and disbelieving, staring down at her like she was something he did not have a category for. Who, he said, are you? She didn't answer, she couldn't. The ground came up to meet her, and the floodlights blurred into a single white smear, and the last coherent thought Grace Sullivan had before everything went dark was, absurdly, that she still hadn't finished counting the MRE boxes. She woke up 40 minutes later to fluorescent light, and the smell of antiseptic, and the sound of 2 medics arguing in low, urgent voices somewhere near her feet. She's got 2nd degree on both palms. One of them was saying, smoke inhalation, minor burns along the forearm, we need to get this uniform off before the fabric fuses too. It's not a uniform, the second voice said. It's a cardigan. She's contractor personnel, there's nothing under there but a t-shirt. Just cut it. Both layers now. Grace surfaced slowly, awareness returning in pieces, the ceiling tiles swimming into focus, the burn on her palms announcing itself with a deep, insistent throb that made her breath catch. She heard fabric tearing, felt cool air against her skin where cloth had been, and then very suddenly the room went quiet. Not empty quiet, wrong quiet. The kind of silence that has a shape to it, a weight, the specific silence of 2 trained professionals looking at something they have absolutely no framework for. Ma'am. A voice, careful now, threaded through with something that hadn't been there 30 seconds earlier. Ma'am, can you hear me? Grace opened her eyes. The younger medic was staring down at her, scissors still open in one gloved hand, and behind him the older one had gone very still, very pale, eyes fixed on something at the center of Grace's chest, where the burnt cardigan had fallen away. She didn't need a mirror to know what they were looking at. Under the ruined civilian cardigan, sewn into the inner lining of the t-shirt she wore beneath it, exactly where regulation required it, and exactly where she had never once, in 11 weeks of playing a logistics coordinator, expected anyone to look, was a small embroidered patch. Black field. A silver compass rose at its center, wrapped in a stylized trident. No unit name, no designation. The kind of insignia that existed on exactly 4 servers in the continental United States and precisely nowhere in any personnel file Cypress Point Annex had ever seen. Pinned just beneath it, small and tarnished with age, was a second piece of silver. A compass rose. No unit designation. No name. Her grandmother's pin. "That's not," the older medic said slowly, "that's not contractor issue." The younger one hadn't moved, hadn't blinked. He was staring at the rank device stitched into the collar seam of the shirt, gold oak leaf, unmistakable even half-burned, and his mouth opened and closed twice before anything came out of it. "That's a lieutenant commander's insignia," he said. "That's a real one." Neither of them said anything else for a long moment. Down the hall, in a glass-walled office that smelled permanently of burnt coffee, the base-duty phone began to ring. It kept ringing, the particular insistent ring of a line that almost nobody outside the installation had the number for, and Commander Petra Voss, who had been awake for 19 hours and was not in the mood for one more problem tonight, picked it up mostly out of muscle memory. Cypress Point Annex, Voss speaking. "Commander." The voice on the other end was male, clipped, unfamiliar, carrying the flatness of someone reading from a script he'd been handed 30 seconds earlier and told not to deviate from. "This is a secure line from the office of the Undersecretary of the Navy. I need you to confirm the status of a patient currently in your medical bay. Female. Approximately 27 years of age. Admitted within the last hour with burn injuries." Voss sat up straighter without deciding to. "We've got a civilian contractor with burns from tonight's structure fire, yes. She's stable. Why is the Undersecretary's office calling about a contractor at 11 o'clock at night?" A pause on the line. The kind of pause that told Voss, more clearly than any words could have, that she had just asked the wrong question in exactly the right direction. "She is not a contractor, Commander." "Excuse me? I need you to seal every exit on that installation. Nobody in, nobody out. No phone calls, no emails, no radio traffic regarding tonight's incident until further notice. This includes your own chain of command below the level of installation commander. I need you to personally confirm the patient is not moved, not questioned, and not photographed until a response team arrives on site. With respect, sir, I don't even know who I'm speaking to. You don't need to. You need to lock this base down in the next 4 minutes, or I promise you, this conversation will be the least of what you have to explain by morning." The line went dead. Voss sat still for exactly 3 seconds, staring at the phone in her hand the way a person stares at something that has just proven itself capable of biting. Then she stood and reached for the base-wide intercom, and her voice, when it came, was steadier than she felt. "This is Commander Voss. Effective immediately, Cypress Point Annex is under full lockdown. All personnel remain in current location, all exterior gates secure. All communications regarding tonight's training incident are suspended pending further instruction. This is not a drill." Somewhere across the base, red lights began flashing over doors that had never once, in 9 years, been sealed for anything but a fire. And in the medical bay, lying on a gurney with her hands wrapped in gauze, and a compass rose pin lying exposed against her burned skin, Grace Sullivan heard the lockdown announcement roll through the corridor outside and understood, with a calm that surprised even her, that the folder marked Inquiry 40-7 had just stopped being something she controlled. Somebody, somewhere above her pay grade and possibly above the Undersecretary's too, already knew exactly who she was. Which meant the real question, the one that mattered, was no longer whether her cover was blown. It was who had been waiting for it to break, and how long they'd been waiting to see what she'd do once it did. Those were questions for tomorrow. Tonight, lying on a gurney with her hands wrapped in gauze, and her cover blown wide open, under 2 pairs of stunned, disbelieving eyes, all Grace knew for certain was that 11 weeks of careful invisibility had ended in the space of about 4 minutes, and there was no folder thick enough, no story convincing enough, to put it back together again. The younger medic finally found his voice. "Ma'am," he said again, and this time it came out closer to a question than a form of address. Who exactly are you? Grace closed her eyes. That, she said, is a very long story. And for the first time in 11 years, she found herself wishing her grandmother were there to help her decide how much of it to tell. 300 miles away, in an office with no name on the door, a phone lit up with a single message. Stap, compromised. And the man who read it did not look surprised at all. He set the phone face down on his desk, folded his hands, and waited. Whatever came next, he had been waiting for it a very long time. The room they moved Grace to had no windows, no clock, and a door that locked from the outside, which told her more about the next 48 hours than any briefing document could have. Her hands throbbed under 2 layers of gauze, a slow, insistent pulse that matched her heartbeat almost exactly, and somewhere beneath the burn cream and the antiseptic smell of the room, she could still catch a phantom trace of smoke clinging to the inside of her nose. The kind that didn't wash out in one shower. The kind that would take a week to fully disappear and considerably longer to stop showing up behind her eyelids every time she tried to sleep. Because rooms like that only existed for 2 reasons: punishment or protection. She was about to find out it was neither. Rear Admiral Louisa Trent walked in at 600, wearing a uniform so crisp it looked like it had never once encountered weather, carrying a single folder under one arm, and closed the door behind her with the particular quiet click of someone who had done this exact thing, in this exact kind of room more times than she cared to count. Lieutenant Commander Sullivan. She said the rank like she was testing whether it still fit. You gave Commander Voss quite a night. I pulled 12 men out of a fire. You did. Trent set the folder down on the small metal table between them. Didn't open it yet. You also blew 11 weeks of undercover placement in under 4 minutes, in front of 24 witnesses, on a secure installation, which means I now have paperwork stacked up to my ceiling, and exactly one useful asset left in this entire operation. That asset is you. Bandaged hands and all. With respect, ma'am, I didn't have a lot of alternatives. The rear exit was sealed, I know. Something moved across Trent's face, brief, unreadable. That's actually why I'm here. Grace went very still. Because that sentence, said in that tone, meant something specific in the world she'd spent 5 years learning to operate inside. It meant the thing that had almost killed 12 men last night was not, in fact, an accident anyone was still calling an accident. Ma'am. The fire marshal's preliminary report came back 4 hours ago. Trent finally opened the folder, slid a single page across the table. I'll save you the technical language. 2 of the 6 smoke canisters used in that shoot house last night were not standard issue. The chemical compound inside them had been altered, deliberately, enough to increase burn temperature by roughly 40% over anything on the approved manifest. Grace picked up the page with bandaged hands that didn't want to cooperate, scanned it twice, and felt something cold settle low in her stomach that had nothing to do with the burns. And the rear exit, modified. Someone replaced the panic bar mechanism with a version that looked identical but failed to disengage under load. Whoever did it had access to that structure, knowledge of its maintenance schedule, and at least 4 days to work without anyone noticing. 4 days ago, I flagged a frayed rope on the cargo net obstacle. Grace's voice came out flatter than she intended. Nobody replaced that either. I read your reports, Commander. All of them. Every single one you filed in 11 weeks. And every single one that got quietly buried by somebody 2 levels above the person who was supposed to act on them. Trent's voice went hard around the words, which is, coincidentally, exactly the pattern your inquiry was built to find. Silence stretched between them. Somewhere down the corridor a door opened and closed, muffled, distant, the ordinary machinery of a base slowly waking up to a morning that would turn out to be anything but ordinary. You're telling me somebody tried to kill 12 SEAL candidates, Grace said slowly, to send a message to a supply clerk nobody was supposed to notice. I'm telling you somebody escalated. Whether it was aimed at you specifically, or whether it was aimed at burying evidence inside that structure, I don't know yet. What I do know is that Kessler Dynamics has a training materials contract renewal, up for signature in 11 days, worth just under $200 million. And if this fire had gone the way it was supposed to go, that shoot house and everything inside it would have been reduced to slag, before anyone thought to ask why the smoke canisters burned wrong. 12 men were supposed to burn with it. I don't think that was incidental to the plan, Commander. I think it was the point. Trent's voice didn't rise, didn't need to. A tragedy nobody questions is easier to bury than an inspection nobody wants. She slid a second page across the table. This one a procurement summary stamped with a routing code Grace recognized instantly from her own 11 weeks of quiet digging. Kessler Dynamics has held that contract for 6 years running. Every renewal cycle, they've been the only bidder invited past the first round. Every renewal cycle, somebody inside procurement has found a reason to disqualify their competitors before the paperwork even reaches full committee review. That's not bad luck, Commander. That's architecture. Somebody built this system to funnel $200 million a year to one company, and they built it well enough that it survived 6 separate audit cycles without a single flag. Until my report started asking why the numbers didn't match the deliveries. Until then, yes. Trent's eyes didn't leave hers. 4 days after your third report went into the system, that fire happened. I don't believe in coincidences that convenient, and neither, I suspect, do you. Grace set the page down. Flexed her bandaged fingers, slow, testing the burn, using the pain the way she'd learned to use pain a long time ago. As a clock. As a reminder that time was moving whether you were ready for it or not. I want off this assignment. Trent didn't blink. Say that again. I've spent 11 weeks counting boxes for a case that just tried to kill 12 people. My hands are burned through to the second layer. My cover is gone. Every person on this base now knows my rank, my files compromised. And there is exactly nothing left for me to do here, except sit in a room with no windows while somebody else finishes the job I started. Is that actually what you want? It doesn't matter what I want. It matters to me. Trent leaned forward, and something in her posture shifted, softened at the edges without losing an ounce of its authority. Because I've read your personnel file too, Commander. Not just the last 11 weeks. All of it. I know what happened to your grandmother during Korean War-era service, or what almost happened, or what got quietly buried the exact same way your reports got buried this year. I know your mother left the Navy's orbit the day she turned 18 and never looked back. And I know you enlisted anyway, 5 years ago, for reasons that had nothing to do with a paycheck and everything to do with a locked box you found under a bed when you were 14 years old. Grace's breath caught, just slightly. Just enough that Trent noticed, and didn't push, and let the silence do the work instead. How do you know about the box? Because your grandmother's file crossed my desk 11 months ago. Commander, when a routine records digitization project flagged an anomaly in a 60-year-old personnel record that should have been fully declassified decades ago and wasn't. A citation with half its content redacted. A photograph of 6 women nobody bothered to name properly in the official record. I didn't connect it to Q until I saw your enlistment paperwork 3 weeks later. Trent's expression didn't change, but something underneath it did. I've been trying to find out why that file was never fully released for 11 months. I think last night's fire and that 60-year-old redaction might be closer to the same problem than either of us wants them to be. The room went quiet in a different way then. Not empty. Loaded. You're saying this isn't just about a defense contract. I'm saying I don't know yet what this is about. I'm saying I have a working theory, and a woman with your specific set of skills, your specific family history, and your specific reason to want answers. And I would very much like you to help me find out before somebody else gets hurt, trying to bury it deeper. Trent closed the folder. You can walk away. Nobody will hold it against you. You've already done more than most people would have, and you did it with your bare hands in a burning building. But if you stay, this is the last time I ask. After this, it's an order, and orders don't leave room for second thoughts at 2 a.m. Grace looked down at her bandaged hands. Thought about 12 men who would be alive today, because she hadn't asked permission before going over a fence. Thought about a woman in Bakersfield who had died with a story locked inside her, because nobody with the right authority had ever come looking hard enough to earn it. One condition, Grace said. Name it. I pick my own team. For the first time since she'd walked into the room, Rear Admiral Louisa Trent almost smiled. Commander, she said, I was hoping you'd say that. Master Chief Owen Reyes found Grace 3 hours later in the base gymnasium, working a heavy bag left-handed, because her right palm was still too raw to close a fist around anything, and he stood in the doorway for a long moment before he said anything at all. Heard you're not a logistics coordinator. Heard right. Heard you outrank me by a fair margin too. That part's true as well. He crossed the gym floor slowly, the way a man walks when he's deciding how much of what he's about to say he actually means. 12 men are alive this morning because you didn't wait for permission last night. I don't care what your rank insignia says. I care that you went into a building nobody trained you to survive, and came out the other side with all 12 of my guys breathing. I had good teachers. Must have. He studied her for a moment, something calculating behind the words. I'm told there's a team forming. Something to do with the fire not being an accident. You're well informed for a man who wasn't in the room. Base this size, word travels. Reyes crossed his arms. I'm told the person forming that team gets to pick who's on it. She does. Then I'd like to volunteer. Grace stopped working the bag. Studied him back. The soot still faintly visible in the lines of his knuckles from a fire he hadn't managed to fully scrub away. The particular steadiness in a man who had spent 18 years learning not to flinch at things that would break most people. You understand what you'd be volunteering for. This isn't sanctioned SEAL business. This is an intelligence inquiry into a defense contractor with government protection and $200 million riding on nobody asking the wrong questions. I understand somebody tried to burn 12 of my men alive to protect a contract renewal. Rhea's voice didn't rise, but something underneath it went very cold. I'm not asking you to make it sanctioned. I'm asking you to let me help you find out who did it. Alvarez wants in too. A new voice from the doorway. Petty Officer Nolan Alvarez leaned against the frame, a bandage still taped above one eyebrow where a piece of falling debris had caught him on the way out. Figured I'd save you the trip to go ask him. You were unconscious for part of that fire, Alvarez. I was conscious enough to know somebody in a cardigan carried me out of a building that was actively trying to kill me. I owe that somebody a favor, and I intend to collect it by making sure whoever set that fire doesn't get to walk away clean. He straightened, the boyish edge in his voice sharpening into something older. Also, I've got 22 months left on this contract, and absolutely nothing better to do. Grace looked between the two of them, weighing it the way she weighed everything, quietly, quickly, and settling on an answer that had, honestly, never been in much doubt. Fine, both of you. But this isn't a training exercise. If it goes bad for real. Wouldn't be much of a fire, Alvarez said, if it didn't. By noon, the story of what had happened in Building 14 had already reshaped itself into something closer to legend than fact, the way stories on a military base always did, passed hand to hand until nobody quite remembered which parts were true. Marjorie Fenn heard 3 different versions before lunch. In the first, Grace Sullivan was a Navy SEAL herself, which wasn't true. In the second, she was C, which also wasn't true, though considerably closer. In the third, delivered by a nervous young clerk who swore his cousin had heard it from someone in medical. She'd walked into the fire without so much as raising her heart rate, which was, Marjorie suspected, probably the least accurate version of all, and also somehow the one she believed most. She found Grace outside Building 14 that afternoon, packing the last of a desk that had never really belonged to her, and stood in the doorway a moment before speaking. So, Marjorie crossed her arms. Logistics coordinator. That was the file, yes. I told you my nephew does that thing. The not flinching thing. Marjorie's voice wasn't accusing. If anything, it carried something almost like relief, the particular satisfaction of a suspicion finally confirmed. I didn't think I'd be right, exactly. I just thought I wasn't wrong. You weren't wrong. Good. Marjorie held out a hand and Grace shook it, gauze and all. For what it's worth, you were a lousy box counter. Kept losing your place around 40. Grace almost laughed, the first real one in 2 days. I'll work on it. Don't bother. I don't think you're coming back to this desk. Marjorie's eyes were sharper than her tone let on. Whatever it is you're actually doing now, Sullivan, be careful. This base has a way of forgetting people who ask the wrong questions. She left before Grace could ask what, exactly, she meant by that, and Grace stood alone in the empty cubicle a long moment afterward, turning the words over, filing them the way she filed everything. There was a third name on Grace's list before she'd even walked into that gymnasium, and it was a name that had nothing to do with anyone on this base at all. Chief Warrant Officer Foster Ashford had served with the Navy for 31 years, the last 9 of them in a records and archives liaison role so quiet most people forgot he existed until they needed something declassified in a hurry. He'd also, 40 years earlier, been a young enlisted sailor stationed at the same signals facility where Eleanor Whitcomb Sullivan finished out the last 2 years of her classified service, and he had, for reasons Grace only half understood even now, appointed himself an unofficial godfather to a girl he'd first met at Eleanor's funeral, standing quietly near the back of the chapel in dress blues nobody had asked him to wear. Grace remembered that day in fragments, the way grief tends to preserve certain details while erasing others entirely. The smell of lilies, too sweet, overwhelming. Her mother's hand gripping hers too tightly during the folding of the flag. And a stranger in uniform, standing apart from the family section, who had approached her afterward at the reception with a quiet, careful gentleness that had cut straight through 19-years-old grief in a way none of the relatives' condolences had managed. "She talked about you," he'd said, that day. "More than she talked about almost anyone. You should know that. Who are you? Somebody who owed her a debt I never got the chance to repay while she was alive." He'd pressed a small card into her hand, nothing but a phone number, no name. "If you ever need anything at all, call this number." She'd called it exactly 4 times in 8 years. Once when her car broke down in a town 300 miles from anyone she knew. Once when a graduate school recommendation letter needed a signature from someone with real security clearance. Once quietly the week she decided to enlist, needing someone to tell her it wasn't a foolish choice. And once 2 years later, simply because it had been a hard week and his voice on the other end of the line had always, without fail, made hard weeks feel slightly less hard. He had never once in 8 years asked her for anything in return. She called him from a payphone outside the base commissary, because payphones didn't show up on anyone's call log the way a cell phone would. "It's me." A pause on the line, warm and immediate. "Gracie, it's been too long. I need a favor." "Off the books? You always do." Something fond in his voice, undercut by the particular carefulness of a man who had spent 3 decades learning exactly how much to say on an open line. "What kind of favor?" "Records. Old ones. Korean War-era personnel files tied to a signals unit my grandmother served with. There's a piece missing, and I think somebody's been keeping it missing on purpose." The pause this time was longer. "Ashford, I'm here." His voice had changed, just slightly, in a way she couldn't quite name yet, though she would think about that exact half-second of silence a great many times before this was over. "You're asking me to go looking at exactly the sort of thing certain people spent a career making sure nobody ever went looking at. I know. Your grandmother knew that too. Better than anyone." A breath, heavy on the other end. "She used to say some doors get locked twice. Once by the people who don't want them opened, and once by the people who love you, trying to keep you safe from what's on the other side. I'm not asking to be kept safe." "No," Ashford said, quiet now, almost sad. "You never were right. Give me 2 days." He hung up before she could thank him, and Grace stood there a moment longer, with the dead receiver against her ear, telling herself the strange, unsettled feeling in her chest was nothing more than fatigue and burn medication working through her system. It would take her longer than she wanted to admit to understand that it hadn't been either one. The warehouse belonging to Kessler Dynamics' regional distribution center sat 40 minutes east of Cypress Point, a low gray building behind a security gate that looked, on paper, like exactly what it was supposed to be. A logistics hub for training materials, contracted properly, inspected regularly, boring in every way a defense contractor's warehouse was supposed to be boring. Reyes had gotten them in through a legitimate maintenance inspection request, the kind of paperwork nobody questioned, because nobody ever expected it to matter. Grace walked the aisles slowly, running her bandaged fingers along shipping crates stamped with lot numbers and certification stickers, cataloging without appearing to catalog anything at all. Here, Alvarez crouched beside a stack of unopened smoke canister crates, the same model, the same lot designation as the ones used the night of the fire. Certification sticker says these passed inspection 11 days ago. Grace crouched beside him, examined the sticker closely, peeled the edge back with one careful fingernail. Underneath it, faint but unmistakable, was a second sticker. Older. Failed. "They didn't fix the batch," she said quietly. "They covered the failure and shipped it anyway. That's not a paperwork error." Reyes' voice had gone hard. "That's fraud with a body count." Grace photographed the double sticker. 3 angles, careful, methodical. The same discipline that had once taught her to count boxes and log every discrepancy in a file nobody was supposed to read. Because that discipline was about to matter more than it ever had. "There's more," Alvarez said, further down the aisle, holding up an invoice he'd pulled from an open supply binder. "Training rifle optics. Body armor plates. All the same pattern. Certified fail, restickered, shipped anyway. This isn't one bad batch. This is a system. How long has this been happening? Alvarez flipped pages, counting silently, his mouth moving with the numbers. Based on the invoice dates in this binder alone, at least 3 years. 3 years of failed equipment quietly restickered and shipped to installations across the country. 3 years of soldiers and sailors trusting gear that had already failed once, sometimes twice, before anyone put a false pass sticker over the truth and sent it out the door anyway. Grace thought about the frayed rope on the cargo net obstacle. Thought about the reports she'd filed that vanished into a system built, apparently, to make sure nobody with real authority ever saw them in time. We need everything in this building photographed and logged before that gate crew changes shift, she said. We have maybe 90 minutes. They used every one of them. 300 miles away, in the same office with no name on the door, Adrian Kessler stood at a window overlooking a parking lot full of cars that all cost more than most people's annual salary, and listened to a phone call he did not particularly want to be having. They were inside the warehouse for 90 minutes. The voice on the other end belonged to a man named Delgado, head of Kessler Dynamics' Internal Security Division, a man Adrian had inherited along with the company itself and never quite learned to fully trust. Photographed inventory. Certification stickers. Could be nothing. Could be a routine inspection. Nothing about last night's incident at Cypress Point was routine, Delgado. You think it's connected. I think a fire that wasn't supposed to happen the way it happened has people asking questions that were supposed to stay buried a great deal longer than 11 weeks. Adrian pressed 2 fingers against his temple, feeling the particular headache that had been building steadily since a phone call at 11 o'clock the previous night. My grandfather built this company on a single principle, Delgado. Problems get managed quietly, or they get managed loudly. Quietly is always better business. And if it can't stay quiet. Adrian didn't answer right away. Behind him, mounted on the office wall in a frame that had hung there since before he was born, sat a black and white photograph of a young naval officer in dress uniform, jaw set, eyes fixed somewhere past the camera, a commendation citation matted beside it under glass. His grandfather. A man Adrian had been raised to revere without question. A man whose portrait had watched over 3 generations of Kessler family dinners, whose name opened doors that money alone couldn't have opened. He had never once growing up questioned what that commendation actually represented. It had simply always been there. Fact. Foundation. The bedrock a family fortune had been quietly built on top of. He was starting, now 11 months into an inquiry he hadn't asked for, to wonder for the first time in his life exactly how solid that bedrock really was. Keep eyes on the Sullivan woman, he said finally. Quietly. I don't want another fire, Delgado. I want to know exactly what she knows, and I want to know it before she finds a way to make it everyone else's problem too. He hung up before Delgado could answer, and stood a long moment longer in front of his grandfather's photograph, studying the eyes that had watched over every important decision this company had ever made, searching for something in that flat black and white stare that had never, in 36 years, told him anything at all. By the time Grace made it back to her apartment that night, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with sleep and everything to do with the particular weight of finally having proof, there was an envelope waiting on her kitchen table that hadn't been there that morning. No stamp, no return address. Just her name, written in handwriting she recognized instantly, because it was the same handwriting that used to sign birthday cards in green ink every single year without fail. Ashford. Inside, a single photocopied page. A partial personnel roster from a classified signals detachment, dated during the closing years of the Korean War. 6 names listed. 5 of them redacted entirely and 1 left visible almost by accident. A clerical oversight. From decades before anyone thought a granddaughter would come looking. Lieutenant E. Whitcomb. Communications analyst. Commendation recommended, signed and approved by unit commander. And beneath it, in a different hand, a note dated 11 months later. Commendation reassigned. Credit transferred to unit commander per revised after action review. Signed, Kessler. Grace read the name 3 times before her brain finished catching up to what her eyes had already understood. Kessler. Not a coincidence. Not a distant echo of a common surname stretched thin across 70 years of American history. A direct line. A signature on a document that had quietly erased her grandmother's name from her own commendation and replaced it with a man's. A man whose family, 3 generations later, now sat at the head of a company that had been shipping failed equipment to military bases across the country and covering the paper trail with false certification stickers. The same family. The same instinct, apparently, running clean through the decades. Take the credit that belongs to someone with less power to fight for it. Cover the evidence. Move on, richer, cleaner, untouched. Grace sat down slowly at her kitchen table, the photocopied page trembling faintly in her bandaged hand, and let herself feel it for exactly 1 minute. Not the investigator's cold calculation, not the discipline that had carried her through 11 weeks of counting boxes and a burning building besides, just the grief, simple and old and entirely her own. Her grandmother had known this name her whole life, had carried it, silent, through 50 years of a marriage, a daughter, a granddaughter who never once heard her raise her voice above a whisper, had looked at a 15-year-old girl on a fence rail full of soup cans, and said some doors don't open because somebody locked them, and had meant, Grace understood now with a clarity that arrived like a physical blow, that specific door, that specific name. A theft dressed up in a signature so ordinary nobody outside the family had ever thought to question it. 1 minute. That was all she allowed herself. Then she folded the page, careful, precise, and set the timer back on the version of herself that had walked into a fire without waiting for permission. Because grief was a luxury that could wait until the work was finished, and the work, she was beginning to understand, had barely started. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number, 3 words, no signature. Call your mother. Grace stared at the screen for a long moment, heart doing something complicated in her chest, and then she picked up the phone and dialed a number she hadn't used in longer than she wanted to admit. Diane answered on the 4th ring, voice thick with sleep. Grace? It's after midnight, is everything all right? I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth. A long silence. The particular silence of a woman who had been waiting a very long time for a question she'd hoped would never come. Okay? Did you know? About Grandma's commendation. About a man named Kessler. The silence stretched so long Grace thought the call had dropped. Mom. I knew a name, Diane said finally. So quietly Grace had to press the phone hard against her ear to catch it. Not the whole story. Just a name your grandmother said once, late at night when she thought I was asleep on the couch. She was talking to your grandfather. I heard her say it like it was something bitter in her mouth. Kessler. She said it, and then she said, he took it, and I let him because a woman who fights back gets discharged and a woman who stays quiet gets to keep serving. I was 12. I didn't understand it. I just knew it was the kind of thing you weren't supposed to have heard. Why didn't you ever tell me? Because I spent 40 years being angry at the Navy for what it did to her, and somewhere along the way I think I convinced myself that not telling you was the same thing as protecting you. Diane's voice cracked, just slightly, right down the middle. There's more, Grace. Something I've never told anyone. Not your father, not your grandmother, not a soul. Grace went very still, phone pressed hard against her ear, the apartment around her suddenly too quiet. When I was 17, I found a letter in her desk drawer while I was looking for stamps. Addressed to a Navy review board. 3 pages, typed, requesting formal reconsideration of a commendation reassignment from 1953. She never sent it. I know she never sent it because I found the same letter, unopened, unsigned, still in that drawer 20 years later when we cleared out her house. She wrote it and then she was too afraid or too tired or too certain nobody would listen to ever put a stamp on it. You kept that a secret for 30 years. I kept it because I didn't know what to do with it, and because every time I thought about telling you, I imagined you doing exactly what you ended up doing anyway. Signing up. Walking straight into the same machine that broke her, except you'd be walking in with your eyes open, chasing a fight I never had the courage to finish myself. A long breath, unsteady. I was wrong, wasn't I? Yeah, Mom. You were. I'm sorry, Grace. I should have told you years ago. I should have told you before you ever signed anything. Would it have changed my mind? And no, Diane admitted, and there was something almost like a laugh underneath the word. Exhausted and sad and finally honest. You're too much like her for that. You always were. They stayed on the line a long while. After that, not saying much of anything. just breathing together across 300 miles of dark, and for the first time in 5 years the wall between them didn't feel quite so much like a wall. Rear Admiral Trent read the warehouse photographs and the reassigned commendation together the next morning, laid side by side on the same metal table, where she'd first asked Grace to stay, and was quiet for a long time before she finally spoke. "This is bigger than a procurement fraud case, Commander." "Yes, ma'am. I can get you an official evidence team inside that warehouse within the week. Properly warranted, properly documented, admissible in front of a court-martial or a federal grand jury, whichever this ends up requiring." Trent tapped the reassigned commendation page once, gently, like it might bruise under too much pressure. "What I can't get you, not in a week, not with any paperwork I have access to, is the physical backup archive Ashford says still exists at a regional server facility. Real-time sensitive evidence like that has a way of disappearing the moment somebody official starts asking for it through channels. Which means we go get it first, off the record. Which means if it goes wrong, Commander, I will not be able to protect you the way I could if this were sanctioned." Trent's eyes held hers without wavering. "I need you to understand that clearly before you walk out that door. This isn't a training exercise anymore. If it goes bad for real, and there won't be a folder thick enough to bring any of you back from it." "Understood, ma'am." "Then go," Trent said quietly, "and bring back something I can actually use." 3 days later, Grace's team moved on a Kessler Dynamics regional server facility outside a small industrial park. Working off intelligence Ashford had quietly assembled about a physical backup archive that predated the company's cloud migration. One that might still contain uncorrupted procurement records from before the falsified certifications began. The building sat at the far end of an access road lined with sodium lights, spaced just far enough apart to leave pools of genuine darkness between them, and Grace had chosen the approach window specifically for the 11-minute gap between security patrols that Ashford's intelligence had promised would be there. "Comms check," Reyes murmured. Low, professional. The particular calm of a man who had done this 100 times before in places considerably worse than an industrial park in California. 5 by 5, Alvarez answered. "Copy." Grace exhaled slowly, watching the building through a pair of borrowed night vision optics, counting the seconds on the patrol window in her head the way her grandmother had once taught her to count breaths before a shot. In, out, halfway, then still. "We move in 30 seconds. It was supposed to be simple, in and out. Photograph what they could, copy what they could, leave no trace they'd ever been there. It went wrong in under 4 minutes. "We've got company," Reyes said, low into his radio, flat against the server room wall, watching 2 unmarked sedans roll into the parking lot with their headlights off. "That's not a random patrol. Somebody knew we were coming." "Copy that." Grace's voice stayed level even as her pulse spiked. "Alvarez, status on the archive drive." "Almost got it. 30 more seconds." 30 seconds, in a building that had just been surrounded by people who had arrived far too fast, far too precisely, for this to be coincidence. "We don't have 30 seconds, Reyes said. "Then get me 20. The first shout came from outside, muffled through reinforced glass, and then the lights in the server room cut out entirely, plunging them into a darkness broken only by the blinking status lights of server racks and the narrow beam of Alvarez's flashlight. Still working, still trying. "Got it." Alvarez pulled the drive free, shoved it into his vest, and that was the exact moment the rear door blew inward. What followed happened too fast for any of them to reconstruct cleanly afterward. A chaos of shouted commands and flashlight beams and bodies moving through darkness that shouldn't have contained other people at all. Grace counted at least 4 hostiles by sound alone, boots on concrete, radios crackling with a discipline that told her these weren't rent-a-cop security guards improvising a response. These men had trained for exactly this, which meant they'd been expecting exactly this. Somewhere in the middle of it, Alvarez went down hard, a cry cut short, and Grace was moving toward the sound before her brain had finished deciding to move at all. Alvarez hit. His voice, tight with pain, came from near the loading dock, ragged around the edges in a way that made her chest go cold. "Leg. I'm okay, go." She wasn't going anywhere without him. She found him by touch in the dock, blood already slicking her bandaged palm where she pressed it hard against the wound in his thigh, and the next 90 seconds blurred into pure instinct, dragging him toward the rear exit, while Reyes laid down enough noise and movement to buy them the confusion they needed. A flashlight beam swept past 18 inches from her face and she froze, breath held, Alvarez's weight heavy and trembling against her shoulder until the beam moved on. "Move," she breathed now. Somehow, impossibly, all three of them made it into the tree line behind the facility before the second wave of security arrived, and they didn't stop moving until the industrial park was 2 miles behind them, and Alvarez's leg wound had been field-dressed well enough, with a torn strip of Reyes' undershirt and pressure applied by a hand that wouldn't stop shaking, to survive the drive back. "Somebody knew," Reyes said, once they were finally moving, engine humming under 3 people breathing hard in the dark. Somebody knew exactly which building, exactly which night, exactly which door to watch. Grace sat in the back seat with the recovered drive clutched in one bandaged hand, running the timeline in her head, over and over, because there were exactly 4 people who had known the details of tonight's operation. Herself, Reyes, Alvarez, and Ashford. She didn't want to think it, refused to think it for almost a full minute, running through every alternative explanation her mind could produce. Surveillance, a leak somewhere higher up the chain, sheer bad luck. Except bad luck didn't know which specific door led to the archive room. Except surveillance didn't explain how 2 unmarked sedans arrived within 4 minutes of Alvarez pulling that drive free. Except every alternative explanation required a coincidence stacked on a coincidence. And Grace had learned a long time ago, from a grandmother who'd spent her whole life being erased by exactly this kind of quiet, deliberate arrangement, that coincidences that convenient were never actually coincidences at all. She called Ashford from a gas station 40 miles from the facility, hands shaking now, though not from the cold. "It's done," she said when he picked up. "We got the drive, thank God." Relief, warm and immediate, and it was that warmth, that specific practiced warmth, that finally told her everything she needed to know. Was there trouble? Alvarez took a bullet in the leg. He'll live. She let the silence sit there a moment, watching a truck pull into the gas station under the sodium lights, watching her own reflection ghost across the payphone glass. "You want to know how they knew we were coming, Ashford?" A pause. "Just half a second too long. Don't understand the question. I think you do." Her voice came out steadier than she felt, flat and certain the way it had sounded going into a burning building barely a week ago, because some things about her had never really changed, not underneath. 4 people knew the details of tonight's operation. 3 of us just got shot at inside that facility. You were the 4th? Gracie. Her name in his voice, carrying 40 years of birthday cards signed in green ink, carrying the memory of a man standing quietly in dress blues at her grandmother's funeral. "You have to let me explain." "Then explain." The silence on the other end of the line lasted longer than any silence had any right to last. And when Ashford finally spoke again, his voice had lost every trace of warmth it had carried a moment before, replaced by something raw and exhausted, and underneath it all, deeply, terribly afraid. "They have my daughter's medical debt," he said quietly. $200,000 I couldn't pay on a Navy pension, cancer treatment insurance wouldn't fully cover, and 8 months ago a man I'd never met called me with a payment plan I didn't ask for, and a single condition attached to it. Tell them what Grace Sullivan is working on. That's all. Just tell them. You could have come to me and said what? That I sold out the granddaughter of the only woman who ever treated me like family, because I was too proud and too scared to ask for help. His voice cracked, finally, all the way through. "I didn't know about the fire, Gracie. I swear to you on your grandmother's grave, I didn't know they'd try to hurt anyone. I thought I was just feeding them information about a records inquiry. By the time I understood what it had turned into, I was already in too deep to climb back out." Grace closed her eyes, standing in the sodium glow of a gas station 40 miles from a building where a 19-year-old sailor had taken a bullet 20 minutes ago, and felt something complicated settle into her chest. Not quite forgiveness. Not quite the fury she probably should have felt instead. Just exhaustion and grief, and the particular ache of understanding all at once that the people who loved you and the people who could be used against you were sometimes, terribly, the exact same people. "Who's the man who called you?" she said finally. "The one with the payment plan." "I don't know his name." Ashford's voice had gone hollow. "But I know where the money came from. It routed through a holding account tied to Kessler Dynamics Government Affairs Division. Same building where a man named Warren works. High up, high enough that people don't say his last name out loud on an open line. Grace stood very still in the cold night air, watching her own breath fog in front of her, feeling the last piece of a very old, very patient puzzle click quietly into place. Kessler Dynamics hadn't been operating alone. Somebody inside the government itself had been protecting them, funding them, making certain that a records inquiry into a 70-year-old stolen commendation and a 3-year fraud scheme never got anywhere near the surface. And whoever that was, he had just made his first mistake. He'd let Grace Sullivan find out his name was Warren. She hung up the payphone without saying goodbye, because there was nothing left to say that either of them could survive hearing, and stood alone under the sodium lights a long moment, listening to Alvarez breathing hard and steady in the car behind her, feeling the weight of everything she now knew settle into her shoulders like a second uniform she hadn't asked to wear. Somewhere behind that name, Warren, sat the last locked door her grandmother had never lived long enough to open, and for the first time since she'd found a wooden box under a bed at 14 years old, Grace understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that she was the only person left standing who could finally knock. Grace didn't sleep that night. She sat in the passenger seat of Reyes's truck for the 2-hour drive back to Cypress Point, with Alvarez stretched across the back bench, leg elevated, drifting in and out of a pain medication haze, and she stared out the window at dark highway sliding past and turned Ashford's confession over and over in her mind until it stopped hurting in any new way it hadn't already hurt an hour ago. "You going to have him arrested?" Reyes asked, quiet, eyes on the road. "I don't know yet. He got Alvarez shot. I know that too." Grace pressed her thumb against the edge of the compass rosepin in her pocket, an old habit, one that had started sometime around her grandmother's funeral, and never quite gone away. "But he also just handed us the only piece we didn't have. A name, Warren. Do you understand what that name is worth right now, weighed against everything else? I understand it doesn't make what he did okay, it doesn't." Grace closed her eyes, exhaustion pulling at her in slow, heavy waves. "Nothing makes it okay. But this isn't about okay anymore, Reyes. It's about who's still standing at the end of it, and how many more people don't have to end up like the 3 we haven't even found yet." Neither of them said anything else for the rest of the drive. In the back seat, Alvarez muttered something in his sleep that might have been a curse word, or might have been a prayer, and Grace didn't ask which, because some things were better left exactly where they landed. Ashford turned himself in before sunrise. He didn't wait for anyone to come collect him. He drove to Cypress Point himself, parked in the visitor lot he'd used 100 times over 3 decades, and walked into Rear Admiral Trent's office at 500 with his service record under one arm and an expression Grace would spend a long time afterward trying to find a single word for. Not guilt exactly, something heavier than guilt, something closer to relief. "I want to make a statement," he told Trent before she'd even finished pouring her coffee. "Full accounting. Every call, every payment, every piece of information I passed along. And I want Grace Sullivan in the room when I give it." She was. He sat across the same metal table where Grace had once been offered a way out of this whole mess and had chosen, instead, to walk deeper into it, and he told the truth in a voice that had gone flat and careful, the voice of a man reciting something he'd rehearsed alone in a car at 4 in the morning, because saying it any other way might have broken him entirely. "The money came through 3 separate accounts before it reached me. Untraceable, I was told. I believed that, because I wanted to believe it, because believing it let me keep taking it without looking too hard at what I was actually doing." His hands, folded on the table, hadn't moved once since he sat down. "I have every wire transfer documented. Every phone call logged, dates and times, even the ones I made from payphones because I thought that made me clever instead of just scared. It's all yours, Commander. All of it." "Why now?" Grace asked, not unkindly, just honestly, because she needed to understand it. "Because a 19-year-old kid took a bullet in his leg 2 nights ago for information I sold to people who were never supposed to have it." Ashford's voice cracked, finally, all the way through the careful rehearsal. "Because your grandmother trusted me with the one thing she never trusted anyone else with, which was you, and I sold that trust to a man I've never even met for a payment plan on my daughter's hospital bills. There isn't a version of this where I get to keep pretending that was a reasonable trade." Trent slid a legal pad across the table. "Start from the beginning, Mr. Ashford. We have all day. It took most of it. By the time he finished, Trent had enough documented financial evidence to trace the payment structure 3 layers deep, straight through a shell account, registered to a holding company, with exactly one signature authority attached to it. A name that meant nothing to most people. A name that meant everything to the 3 of them sitting in that room. Warren Pierce, Deputy Undersecretary for Acquisition Oversight. A man whose signature, it turned out, appeared on the original Kessler Dynamics contract renewal 7 years ago, and on every renewal since, and on the internal memo, buried 4 levels deep in a records system that had never been designed for anyone to actually read it, closing out 3 separate prior safety incident investigations involving Kessler Dynamics equipment with the exact same conclusion each time. No further action recommended. 3 incidents. Grace read the summary line twice, feeling something go cold and very still in her chest. Before hours. A structural fire at a training facility in 2019, equipment malfunction officially. 2 injuries, no fatalities, case closed within 6 weeks. Trent's voice had gone quiet in the particular way it went quiet when something mattered enough that volume would only get in the way. A live fire exercise in 2021 where body armor plates failed to stop rounds they were rated for. 1 fatality. Ruled equipment defect, manufacturer not held liable due to, and I'm quoting the memo directly here, insufficient evidence of gross negligence. And the 3rd. Last year. A training accident involving faulty communications equipment that delayed a medevac response by 11 minutes during a live exercise gone wrong. The delay was ruled a contributing factor in 1 death. The equipment was traced back to Kessler Dynamics. The investigation closed in 4 weeks, and Warren Pierce personally signed off on the finding that no further review was warranted. Grace sat with that for a long moment. 3 deaths. Not counting the 12 men who very nearly became a 4th incident in the same file, closed the same way, buried under the same signature, if she hadn't gone over a fence barely a week ago without waiting for anyone's permission. He's been doing this for at least 6 years. At least. Trent closed the folder every single time the pattern's identical. Equipment fails, someone gets hurt or killed. The investigation gets routed through Pierce's office, and the investigation closes fast, quiet, and always with the same finding. No further action. He's not just protecting a defense contract, Commander. He's protecting a body count. Grace read the 3 names attached to those incidents twice, slowly, the way she'd learned to read things that mattered. Corporal James Whitlow, 24, killed by a body armor failure that shouldn't have been possible on equipment, rated for exactly the round that killed him. Petty Officer Dana Marsh, 29, dead from a delayed medevac response that a working radio would have prevented by 11 full minutes. And a 3rd name, older, a training accident from 6 years prior that predated even the digitized records, a man named Elias Cho, whose file had been so thoroughly closed that Trent's team had needed a court order just to confirm he'd existed at all. 3 names. 3 families who had spent years believing the deaths of people they loved were simply bad luck, the ordinary cruelty of dangerous work. Nothing anyone could have prevented. They all have families, Grace said quietly. They do. Trent's voice had gone very careful. Which means before any of this becomes a hearing, Commander, somebody has to be the one who calls them, tells them what actually happened. That someone signed a piece of paper that let their son, their husband, their brother, die a 2nd time in a filing cabinet nobody was ever supposed to open. I'll make the calls. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. Grace looked up from the folder, something certain and unwavering settling into her expression. But I know what it feels like to spend years not knowing the whole truth about someone you loved. I'm not going to let 3 more families sit with that any longer than they already have. She made the first call that same evening, to a widow in Ohio whose husband, Petty Officer Dana Marsh, had died 11 minutes too late because a radio he trusted with his life had failed him instead of protecting it. Mrs. Marsh, my name is Lieutenant Commander Grace Sullivan. I'm calling about your husband's case. A long pause. That case has been closed for 2 years. I know it has. I'm calling because it shouldn't have been. Grace kept her voice level, careful, the way she'd learned to deliver hard truths without softening them into something false. I have evidence that the equipment failure that delayed his medevac response was known to the manufacturer before it shipped. I have evidence that a federal official closed the investigation without properly reviewing it. I wanted you to hear that from someone directly, before it becomes a headline you read about from a stranger. The silence on the other end lasted so long, Grace wondered if the call had dropped. 2 years, the woman said finally, voice thick. 2 years I told myself it was nobody's fault, that it was just bad luck. Do you have any idea what that does to a person, Commander? Believing there was nothing anyone could have done, and then finding out there was. I do, actually. Grace thought of a locked wooden box, a redacted citation, 70 years of silence disguised as protection. I understand it better than I wish I did. They talked for almost an hour after that, and by the time Grace hung up, her own hands were shaking in a way the burns alone had never quite managed. The archive drive Alvarez had pulled from that server room, the one that had cost him a bullet in the leg, turned out to contain something even Ashford hadn't known was there. A private communications folder, improperly deleted years earlier in a way that left the underlying data recoverable to anyone patient enough to look, containing internal emails between Adrian Kessler and his company's chief financial officer discussing, in language careful enough to survive a casual audit, but blunt enough to survive nothing more thorough than that, the ongoing cost-benefit calculation of recalling defective equipment versus simply absorbing the occasional lawsuit. One email, dated 14 months earlier, made Grace's hands go cold reading it. Recall costs estimated at $40 million across affected contracts. Litigation exposure per incident historically under $2 million. Most cases settled quietly, several outright dismissed due to sovereign immunity protections on military equipment claims. Recommend continued monitoring rather than recall pending further data. It was signed by the chief financial officer, not by Adrian Kessler. But 3 lines below it, in a reply thread that had also survived the deletion, sat a single line from Adrian's own account. Agreed. Keep me updated. 2 words, agreed. Keep me updated. Not an order to hurt anyone. Not a confession to arson. But an acknowledgement, in writing, from the man whose name sat on the door of the company, that he had known equipment was failing, had known people were being hurt, and had chosen, deliberately, to keep monitoring rather than act. That's not proof he ordered the fire, Reyes said, reading over her shoulder. No, Grace agreed. But it's proof he knew what his company was doing while it was doing it. And it's enough to get him into a room with us, which is the only thing I actually need right now. She requested the meeting through Trent's office, formal, documented, a federal records request attached to a subpoena that had been quietly fast-tracked through a judge Trent knew personally, and the reply came back faster than anyone expected. Adrian Kessler would meet with them, not his lawyers. Him personally, alone, in his own office, that same afternoon. That's either very brave, Alvarez said, limping slightly on a leg that was healing faster than any doctor had predicted, or very stupid. Or he already knows exactly how much we have, Grace said, and he's trying to figure out how to survive it. Trent pulled her aside before they left, in the empty corridor outside the operations center. And there was something in her expression that Grace hadn't seen from her before. Not doubt exactly. Something closer to a warning. You understand what you're walking into. A man with 3 generations of legal counsel, a board of directors who will not survive a scandal of this size, and absolutely no reason to give us anything at all, unless he sees something in it for himself. I understand. He may not confess to a single thing, Commander. He may sit across that desk and let his lawyers do all the talking. And if that happens, I need you to walk out of that room without losing your composure. Because we cannot afford a headline about a Navy officer intimidating a defense executive. Not with a case this fragile. I won't lose my composure. You went over a chain-link fence into a burning building without waiting for permission from anyone. Something almost like a smile flickered across Trent's face. Forgive me for double-checking. This is different, is it? Grace thought about that for a moment, honestly, before she answered. This one I actually have time to think through first. That's the only difference that matters. The Kessler Dynamics headquarters occupied the top 4 floors of a glass tower in Northern Virginia, the kind of building designed to make visitors feel small before they'd even reached the elevator. And Grace rode up in silence with Trent beside her, both of them dressed for a conversation that had nothing to do with uniforms and everything to do with the particular armor a person puts on before walking into a room they know will hurt. Adrian Kessler's office occupied the entire northwest corner of the top floor, floor-to-ceiling glass on 2 sides, and he was standing at the window when they walked in, exactly where Grace suspected he'd been standing for most of the morning, watching a parking lot full of cars that meant nothing to him anymore. He turned when the door closed, younger than she'd expected somehow, despite knowing his exact age from the file, tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. "Commander Sullivan." He said her name carefully, like he'd practiced it. "I've been expecting you for longer than you probably realize. Since 11 months ago, when my grandmother's file crossed the wrong desk, or since barely a week ago, when your smoke canisters nearly killed 12 men. Grace stayed near the door, Trent a half-step behind her. "Which one, Mr. Kessler?" "Both." He gestured toward 2 chairs across from his desk, didn't sit himself, remained standing at the window like the glass was the only thing keeping him upright. "I found out about the fire the same morning you did. I want you to know that. I want you to believe that, even though I understand you have absolutely no reason to. Convince me." He was quiet a long moment, and behind him, mounted on the wall Grace had seen only in photographs until now, hung the black and white portrait of his grandfather in dress uniform, watching the whole conversation, with eyes that had never told anyone anything at all. "My grandfather built this company on a lie," Adrian said finally, and something in his voice broke open on the word lie in a way that told Grace, more clearly than any evidence Trent's team had gathered, that this particular truth had been sitting inside him a very long time, waiting for someone to finally ask the right question. He served with a woman named Eleanor Whitcomb during the Korean War, a communications analyst. Brilliant, from everything I've since been able to find, in a field where brilliance from a woman meant absolutely nothing to the review boards that decided whose name went on a commendation. "I know what he did. I know you do. I've known since I found the same records you found, 11 months ago, back when I still believed I could quietly fix a 70-year-old wrong without anyone ever having to know it happened in the first place." Adrian's hand, resting on the windowsill, had gone white-knuckled. "I was going to reissue the commendation properly. Anonymous restoration through a foundation, no company name attached, nothing that would touch our stock price or embarrass anyone currently living. I had the paperwork drafted 8 months ago. What stopped you?" "Warren Pierce." The name landed in the room like something physical. "He found out what I was planning before I'd even filed the paperwork. Somebody on my own legal team must have mentioned it to somebody who mentioned it to somebody else, the way these things always leak eventually, and Pierce called me himself. Personally. First and only time he's ever called me directly in 7 years of contract renewals." Adrian's voice had gone very quiet. "He told me that reopening any part of my grandfather's record risked triggering exactly the kind of audit that would expose things considerably more current and considerably more damaging than a 70-year-old commendation dispute. He told me, and I'm quoting him precisely because I've replayed this conversation in my head roughly 1,000 times since, that some doors stay locked because the people who locked them understood something the rest of us hadn't figured out yet." Grace felt the floor tilt very slightly beneath her, hearing her grandmother's own words handed back to her through the mouth of the man who had spent 30 years benefiting from everything those words had been protecting. "He threatened you. He reminded me what I stood to lose." Which is a threat, dressed up nicely enough that I let myself pretend it wasn't one, for considerably longer than I should have. Adrian finally sat, heavily, across from them, and up close Grace could see exactly how much this conversation was costing him. "I knew about the failed equipment. I knew we were shipping restickered inventory instead of absorbing recall costs. I approved the continued monitoring instead of the recall, because Pierce made it very clear that any disruption to our contract, any audit, any scrutiny at all, would surface things I wasn't prepared to have surfaced. I told myself I was protecting my company. What I was actually doing was protecting a man who had spent 6 years using my family's oldest secret as leverage to keep me compliant while he ran a body count nobody was supposed to notice. 12 men nearly died because you stayed compliant. I know." His voice broke fully on those 2 words. "I know, and there is no version of an apology large enough to matter to any of them, and I understand that. But I did not order that fire, Commander. I want that on record clearly because it's true, and because it's the only thing in this entire conversation I can say with complete certainty. I found out about it from the news, the same as everyone else, and I spent that entire day sick to my stomach wondering if my silence had somehow made me responsible for it anyway." "You were?" Grace's voice came out quiet, but it landed harder than anything shouted could have. Not for lighting the match. But every quiet email you sent, instead of a recall order, built the exact conditions that made lighting that match possible. You don't get to separate those two things just because you didn't personally strike it. Adrian flinched visibly and didn't argue the point, because there wasn't an argument left in him that could survive being said out loud in that particular room. "You're right," he said finally. "I've spent 11 months telling myself there was a meaningful difference between silence and action. There isn't. There never was. I just needed there to be one, so I could keep looking at myself in a mirror every morning." Trent leaned forward for the first time since they'd sat down. "Who ordered it, Mr. Kessler, if not you?" "I don't know. I have my suspicions and every one of them points back to Pierce's office, but I don't have proof, because Pierce has spent 7 years making absolutely certain that nothing traceable ever touches his own name directly." Adrian looked at Grace then, something almost pleading in his expression. "What I do have is testimony. Everything I just told you. Every email, every phone call, every instruction Pierce ever gave me about what to bury and when. I'll give all of it to federal investigators, on the record under oath, in exchange for exactly one thing. Which is a chance to fix what I can actually fix." His hand trembled slightly, reaching for a drawer in his desk, and Trent's posture shifted instantly, alert, before he pulled out nothing more dangerous than a single folded document. "This is the commendation restoration paperwork. Drafted 8 months ago, never filed. I want your permission, Commander, to file it today, properly, publicly, with my name attached this time, not hidden behind an anonymous foundation. Because your grandmother deserves better than another quiet correction nobody ever has to answer for." Grace stared at the document for a long moment, feeling something complicated move through her chest that had no clean name, gratitude and grief, and a strange, unwanted flicker of something almost like forgiveness she hadn't expected to feel and didn't fully trust. Her phone buzzed before she could answer. A text from Reyes, 3 words that turned the temperature of the entire room. "They found Delgado." "I need to take this," Grace said, already standing. What Reyes had to tell her, once she stepped into the hallway, was that Kessler Dynamics' head of security had been found 40 minutes earlier in a company vehicle in the parking garage. Alive but badly beaten, having apparently tried to intervene when a 2-man team arrived at the regional server facility, with orders to physically destroy the remaining backup archives before federal investigators could subpoena them. "He's talking," Reyes said. "Barely, but he's talking. Says the order came through an encrypted channel he'd used before for Pierce's office specifically. Says they were told to make it look like the same industrial accident cover story used at the warehouse. How long ago? 40 minutes. Which means whoever they sent is either already at that facility or already gone." Grace closed her eyes for exactly 1 second, running the math the way she'd run it 100 times before, in 100 rooms considerably worse than this glass tower. 40 minutes was enough time to destroy physical evidence. It was not quite enough time to destroy everything, if someone moved fast enough right now. She walked back into Adrian Kessler's office and set his own phone down in front of him. "Call your facility manager, right now. Tell him federal marshals are inbound with a court order, and nothing in that building gets touched, moved, or destroyed until they arrive. Or you'll personally be looking at obstruction charges on top of everything else you just confessed to." Adrian didn't hesitate, didn't ask a single question. He picked up the phone and made the call in a voice that had gone hard and certain in a way Grace hadn't heard from him yet. The voice, perhaps, of a man finally doing something that felt like the opposite of everything his family had trained him to do for 3 generations. 40 minutes north, Reyes and Alvarez were already moving. They'd driven straight for the facility the moment Grace's text came through, because waiting in a parked car outside a glass tower in Virginia had never once, in either of their careers, felt like the right way to spend a crisis. "Facility manager's not answering," Reyes said, phone pressed against his ear, watching the exit signs blur past on the highway. "Security line's dead too." "How far out?" 6 minutes. Maybe 7. In the passenger seat, Alvarez leaned forward against a seatbelt that was doing very little to slow the adrenaline working through him, leg brace and all. "Marshals?" "Trent says 50 minutes out. Traffic, jurisdiction paperwork, the usual." Reyes's knuckles had gone white on the wheel. "We're going to beat them there by a wide margin. Which means it's us or nobody for the next 45 minutes. Which means it's us." They arrived to a facility with its front gate standing open, no security visible at the guard booth, and a single unmarked van parked crooked near the loading dock in a way that suggested whoever drove it hadn't much cared about being noticed anymore. Reyes cut the engine 200 feet out, and the two of them approached on foot, quiet, the old instincts settling over both of them like something worn and familiar despite the very unfamiliar civilian setting. Through the loading dock's open door they could hear it. Metal against metal. The particular violent rhythm of someone trying to physically destroy hardware faster than hardware wants to be destroyed. Federal officers, stand down! Reyes's voice cracked across the loading dock with 18 years of command behind it. A bluff, technically, since neither of them carried federal authority of any kind, but a bluff delivered with enough conviction that the two men inside froze mid-swing, sledgehammers raised, faces caught somewhere between panic and calculation. "You're not marshals," one of them said, slow, sizing up the odds. No, Reyes agreed. "But they're 6 minutes out, and you've got maybe 4 servers left standing in that rack, and every second you spend deciding whether to finish the job is a second you're not spending figuring out how to explain this to a federal judge, instead of an obstruction charge that follows you the rest of your life." The two men looked at each other, looked at the half-destroyed server rack behind them, sparks still faintly visible where a hammer had connected with something that hadn't been designed to survive it. Looked, finally, at the open loading dock door and the long empty parking lot beyond it, weighing an escape neither one of them, it turned out, had the stomach to actually attempt. They dropped the sledgehammers before the marshals arrived 6 minutes later and surrendered without further incident, and it would take federal technicians most of the following week to determine exactly how much had been lost. 11 of the 14 targeted server drives, it turned out, had survived intact. The archive Grace's team recovered contained 3 years of res-stickered inventory records, and every email that connected Warren Pierce's signature to 3 prior deaths nobody had been permitted to properly investigate. They didn't finish in time. Not because federal marshals arrived on schedule, but because 2 people who had spent their careers running toward exactly the kind of danger most people spent their whole lives running away from had refused to wait for permission to do it one more time. Neither of the 2 men who surrendered, it turned out, knew the name of the person who had actually given the order. They'd received their instructions the same way Ashford had received his payments. Through layers, through cutouts, through a system built so carefully that almost nobody inside it ever had to look directly at what they were protecting. Almost nobody. Warren Pierce was arrested at his home in McLean, Virginia, 4 days later, on a Sunday morning in front of Uffle and 2 grown children who had, according to the arresting agents, appeared genuinely shocked by every word of the warrant being read aloud in their living room. He did not resist. He did not, in the hours of interrogation that followed, offer much of anything at all beyond a lawyer's careful silence, though the physical evidence recovered from that server facility, combined with Ashford's financial trail and Adrian Kessler's sworn testimony, turned out to require considerably less cooperation from Pierce himself than anyone had initially expected. 6 years of buried investigations, 3 prior deaths, a near catastrophe that would have killed 12 SEAL candidates, and buried the evidence under a training accident nobody would have questioned, exactly the way 3 previous incidents had never been questioned, exactly the way Pierce had been counting on this one not being questioned either. He had simply never accounted for the one variable that broke his entire system. A logistics coordinator who didn't know how to let things go. Ashford's own case moved through a military tribunal separately, quietly, in the weeks before the congressional hearing began, and Grace testified there too, though the room was smaller and the stakes, for one particular man in a Navy uniform he'd worn honorably for 31 years before 8 months of desperation had cost him everything, felt considerably more personal. "He gave us Pierce's name before we had any other way to find it," she told the tribunal panel plainly, without asking for a leniency she wasn't authorized to promise. He surrendered voluntarily. He provided financial documentation that took federal investigators 3 additional weeks to independently verify, every detail of which matched exactly what he'd already told us. "I'm not here to excuse what he did. I'm here to tell you what he did afterward, because I think both halves of that story matter to whatever you decide." Ashford received a dishonorable discharge, a suspended sentence contingent on continued cooperation with federal prosecutors, and a restitution order tied to the payments he'd accepted, structured in a way that would take him the better part of a decade to fully repay. He did not go to prison. He did not either ever fully forgive himself, a fact Grace understood clearly the one time she visited him afterward, in a small apartment 3 states away, and found a man who had aged a decade in the space of 8 months. "Your grandmother would have hated what I did," he told her. Standing in a doorway, he didn't invite her past. "She would have understood why you did it." Grace held his gaze steadily. "Those aren't the same thing, Ashford. But they're not opposites either, Grace." Ashford's voice in his own doorway, 3 states away, had carried the exact same weight her grandmother's voice used to carry, careful and worn and honest in a way most voices never quite managed. "For what it's worth, I am sorry. Every single day. I know." The congressional hearing convened 11 weeks later, in a room with too much fluorescent light and not nearly enough chairs for everyone who wanted to watch, and Grace sat at the witness table in her actual uniform for the first time in longer than she wanted to calculate, rank insignia catching the light every time she shifted, no cardigan anywhere in sight. Her mother sat in the second row. Front row had been reserved for family of the 3 prior victims, and Diane had insisted on that arrangement herself, quietly, the moment she found out those families existed, because some things, she'd said, mattered more than where you got to sit. Grace testified for 2 hours, told it plainly, the way she'd learned to tell things plainly, without embellishment, without asking for sympathy she hadn't earned and didn't need. The fire, the evidence, the pattern of failures traced back 7 years. The 3 families sitting in that front row who had spent years being told their loved ones' deaths were unfortunate accidents. Nothing more. Case closed. No further action recommended. "How did you first become aware of the pattern?" Commander Sullivan, one of the committee members, asked, midway through the 2nd hour. Grace thought about a locked wooden box under a bed, thought about 6 soup cans on a fence rail, and a grandmother who never got to finish her own story, and a granddaughter who had spent her whole life learning how to knock on doors nobody had told her existed. "My grandmother served in a classified communications role during the Korean War," she said. Her commendation was quietly reassigned to a superior officer 70 years ago, and the paper trail from that theft, followed forward through 3 generations, led directly to the company whose defective equipment nearly killed 12 of my colleagues 3 months ago. "I didn't set out looking for a pattern, Senator. I set out looking for the truth about one woman who never got to tell her own story while she was alive to tell it. The pattern found me." During a recess that afternoon, a woman from the front row approached Grace in the hallway outside the hearing room. Small, gray-haired, holding a photograph, in a frame worn soft at the corners from years of handling. "My son was Elias Cho," she said simply, holding the photograph out like an offering. "They told us it was an accident. Nobody's fault. I believed them for 6 years, Commander, because I didn't know there was any other version of the truth to believe instead." Grace looked at the photograph. A young man in uniform, smiling, unaware of everything that would eventually be done in the silence surrounding his death. "I'm sorry it took this long," Grace said, and meant it more than she'd meant almost anything in longer than she could remember. "Don't be sorry." The woman closed Grace's hand gently around the photograph frame for a moment, then took it back. Be the reason it finally stopped. Adrian Kessler testified 2 days later, under a cooperation agreement that would eventually result in a significant fine, a court-ordered restructuring of Kessler Dynamica's government contracts oversight, and a personal guilty plea to charges considerably lighter than the ones facing Warren Pierce, whose trial, when it finally began 8 months later, would end in a conviction on 11 separate counts including obstruction, fraud, and negligent homicide tied to the 3 prior deaths his office had spent 6 years quietly burying. Nobody was executed. Nobody was hunted down in the dark and made to answer for anything with anything sharper than a subpoena. That had never been the point. Not for Grace, not for Trent, not for the 3 families in that front row who had waited years for an answer that finally arrived, wearing the unglamorous, unsatisfying, entirely necessary shape of federal indictments and sworn testimony. It was enough. It had to be enough, because it was the only version of justice that actually held. Race retired from active duty 4 months after the hearing concluded, 18 years of service ending not with a training accident report, but with a folded flag of his own, and a room full of men he'd pulled through fire, both literal and otherwise. He took a position training incoming instructors on equipment verification protocols, a job that hadn't existed before Grace's inquiry, and existed now specifically because of it. Alvarez stayed in, leg fully healed, promoted ahead of his peers for reasons his official file described as exceptional performance under fire, and his own account described, whenever anyone asked, as getting extremely lucky next to somebody who refused to leave anybody behind. "You ever going to admit I saved your life first?" he asked Grace once, months later, at a reunion dinner none of them had planned to have but all of them had shown up for anyway. "Before you saved mine?" "You didn't save my life, Alvarez. I distracted a burning ceiling panel with my body so it wouldn't land on you. That's not the same as saving my life. Feels close enough from where I was standing." Grace laughed. The real kind. Easy now in a way it hadn't been in longer than she could remember, and didn't argue the point any further, because some debts were better left uncounted, the way her grandmother might have said, sitting quietly with a compass rose pin and a story she'd finally, 70 years late, gotten to finish telling. Marjorie Fenn sent a card to the ceremony in Bakersfield, since Cypress Point's records office couldn't spare her for a cross-country trip, and inside it, in handwriting as sharp as her reading glasses, she'd written only one line. "Told you that nephew of mine knew a real one when he saw one." Grace kept the card, filed it carefully, the way she filed everything that mattered. Eleanor Whitcomb Sullivan's commendation was formally restored 6 weeks after the hearing concluded, in a small ceremony held not in Washington, but in Bakersfield, in the same backyard where a 15-year-old girl had once missed 6 soup cans in a row before finally hitting one, because Grace had asked for that specifically, and nobody with any authority left to refuse her. Diane stood beside her that afternoon, holding a folded flag that finally, 70 years late, carried the right name attached to the right act of service, and when the officer presenting it read Eleanor's full citation aloud for the first time in public in 7 decades, Grace watched her mother's face do something she had never once seen it do in 27 years. It softened, all the way through, like a wall finally coming down. The afternoon light fell gold and low across the same fence rail, the same patch of dry California grass, and somewhere in the small crowd a young girl, a neighbor's granddaughter, no older than 9, watched the folded flag change hands with wide, uncertain eyes. The way children watch ceremonies they don't yet have the language to fully understand, but somehow already sense the weight of. Grace caught the girl's eye once, briefly, and smiled, and the girl smiled back, shy, and Grace thought, not for the first time that week, about how many more doors were still out there waiting for somebody brave enough, someday, to finally knock. She would have hated all this attention, Diane said quietly. Afterward, watching a small crowd of neighbors and reporters slowly disperse across a lawn that had once held nothing more dramatic than 6 dented soup cans and a borrowed rifle. She would have loved that it was true, Grace said, even if she hated the attention. Diane laughed, a little shaky, tears standing bright in her eyes. "Yeah, that sounds about right." They stood together a long while after everyone else had gone, mother and daughter, in a backyard that had somehow become the exact center of a story 70 years and 3 generations in the making, and Grace found herself reaching into her jacket pocket for the one thing she'd carried, quietly, through every version of herself she'd ever needed to become. The compass rose pin, small, tarnished, unremarkable to anyone who didn't know what it represented. She held it out to her mother. "I think it's time somebody else carried this for a while." Diane took it carefully, turning it over once in her palm, the same silver, the same worn edges, 70 years of a story finally allowed to breathe out in the open where it had always deserved to live. "I'm not the one who kicked down the door, Grace." "No." Grace closed her mother's fingers gently around the pin. "But you're the one who kept it safe long enough for someone to finally find the courage to knock. That matters just as much, Mom. Maybe more." Diane held the pin against her chest for a long moment, quiet, and when she finally spoke again, her voice had none of the old bitterness left in it at all. "I think she'd be proud of both of us," she said, finally. "I think so too." Grace looked out at the fading light over her grandmother's old backyard, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, the silence around her felt entirely, peacefully, her own. Not the silence of something withheld. Not the silence of a door still waiting to be knocked on. Just quiet, ordinary, well-earned quiet, the kind her grandmother had spent a lifetime never quite getting to have. Somewhere behind them, on a fence rail that had been replaced twice, since Grace was 15 years old, a single soup can still sat exactly where it had fallen. The summer a grandmother taught her granddaughter how to breathe out halfway, hold and trust her own hands. Grace picked it up, turned it over once in the fading afternoon light, and set it back down carefully, exactly where it belonged. Some doors, she thought, didn't need locks anymore. Some doors just needed somebody willing finally to walk all the way through. Grace stayed in the backyard long after the crowd had gone, and the sun had dropped low enough to turn the whole yard the color of old photographs. Sitting on the same fence rail her grandmother had once leaned against, on a Sunday afternoon 13 years earlier, teaching a frightened 15-year-old how to breathe out halfway and trust her own steady hands. She thought about Eleanor, about a wooden box, and a citation half blacked out, and a silence that had lasted 70 years, because nobody with enough power had ever cared enough to break it. She thought about 3 families who finally had answers. About Ashford, learning to live inside a mistake he'd never fully outrun. About Adrian Kessler, somewhere on the other side of the country, trying to build something honest out of the wreckage his family name had left behind. And she thought, quietly, gratefully, about the particular kind of ending that didn't erase any of the hard parts, but made room for them to finally sit beside something like peace. The sun finished setting. The crickets started up somewhere past the fence line. And Grace Sullivan sat exactly where her grandmother once stood, finally, completely, at rest.